And we're back for the third episode of PA Political Digest podcast, a stroll through the annals of Pennsylvania political corruption. A disgraced attorney general whose twin sister also worked there, who went down for lying to the court. Two former House speakers shared the same prison cell for a time. Not one, not two, but three Republican sisters taken down, two of whom were elected officials, and one was their campaign manager. An entire Philadelphia court system eliminated due to fraud and corruption. A powerful Philadelphia state senator with a vacuum fixation, yes, a vacuum fixation, funded by OPM, other people's money, not his. Congressmen taking bribes from fake Arab sheiks. A GOP attorney general went down by what he did in his previous job, who still managed to finish second in the 1994 Republican primary for governor. Multiple state treasurers were indicted, and one who very tragically and publicly killed himself during a press conference live on TV. Even the Capitol building itself was christened with corruption during a scandal when it was built in the early 1900s that in today's dollars would equal nearly $500 million. So as you can see, we have lots to talk about on the Pennsylvania Political Digest podcast, a stroll through the annals of Pennsylvania political corruption. I'm your host, Republican political consultant Christopher Nicholas, and once again I am joined by two longtime observers of the Pennsylvania political scene. First, let's welcome recently retired Capitol reporter Brad Bumstead. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Chris.
Brad's written 2 books on political corruption in Pennsylvania and wrote for the Lancaster News Group and the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, among others. And back again as well is the semi-retired political journalist John Baer, formerly the political columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News. Hi, John.
Pleasure to be with you, Chris.
John's written 1 book on Pennsylvania politics. In this episode, we will look at the rise and fall of South Philly political legend, State Senator Vince Fumo, dubbed later in his career as the Vince of Darkness by Mr. Baer here. He's the guy with the vacuum fixation who coined the phrase OPM, or other people's money. His mantra for how to acquire, steal, or confiscate money from someplace else to pay for all his eccentricities and luxuries. This despite the fact that he inherited a bank and had wealth. That's our primary focus today. Our secondary focus is on the trials and tribulations of so many Democratic congressmen in Philadelphia. Several were ensnared in the infamous ABSCAM sting. You remember that, when FBI agents posed and dressed up as Arab sheiks, yes, Arab sheiks, and went around bribing members of Congress. It even spawned a movie much later called American Hustle. And it was the first scam and sting caught on videotape, then a newfangled invention back in the late 70s. And to the more recent case of Congressman Chaka Fattah of Philadelphia, sent to jail for all the usual Philly reasons. In another only in PA moment, his wife was a top news anchor for a TV station in Philly, and she was tagged in the investigation for the questionable sale of her Porsche convertible to a lobbyist in order to buy a vacation home in the Poconos. So once again, lots to navigate through today. And again, we'll start with Vince Fumo, John Baer, who you coined the new phrase for him, the new moniker, the Vince of Darkness.
Well, Chris, in my view, Vince is probably the most unique politician in modern Pennsylvania history. As you say, Democrat, South Philly, he built an unmatched power base and personal fortune that ran to 8 figures. He owned a bank inherited from his father, who inherited it from his father. Vince held a law degree, a Wharton MBA. He was a member of Mensa, a licensed pilot, a boat captain, an electrician, a plumber. He had so many political, community, and legal links in Philly and beyond that we once had a Daily News graphic with him as an octopus and nicknamed him Octo Vince, in addition to the Vince of Darkness. But he was very effective as a senator, maybe the most effective senator. From 1995 to 2007, he was the Democratic chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee and just brought, by their estimate, $8 billion above the normal state funding to his city and his district. His principal residence was and is a 32-room mansion in Philly's Spring Garden neighborhood near the Art Museum. It's a Gilded Age 1885 four-story brownstone with a ballroom that he turned into what he called an executive-sized office. It has 7 marble fireplaces, a basement shooting range, and a rooftop deck. He still owns it, but it's for sale. The last listing I saw was around $4 million. I say his principal residence because he also had a beach house in Margate, New Jersey, a multi-million-dollar oceanfront home on Jupiter Island in Florida, and a couple of condos in Ventnor where he'd keep his boats. Oh, and a 100-acre farm in Dauphin County outside of Harrisburg. The scope of his wealth became public when he was hit with a massive federal indictment in 2007. More than 130 counts of conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, tax violations, and the ever-popular using government employees for political and personal work. Among other things, the indictment, which, by the way, was 272 pages long, it was so long that the press release announcing it was 9 pages long. And it said he illicitly spent millions of dollars to, for instance, buy a bulldozer for his farm, 19 Oreck vacuum cleaners or floor machines. Anybody who knows anything about Orecks knows they're not cheap. 1 for each floor of his homes. Used his board position at a seaport museum to borrow historic yachts for personal trips, or for spying on old girlfriends, using a nonprofit that he created, something called Citizens Alliance for Better Neighborhoods, for shopping sprees and to buy SUVs. He went to prison, and something that people forget about Vince, that he was in this game a long, long time. In fact, he was indicted at age 31, even before getting elected to the state senate. And as is not untypical in Philadelphia, he was elected in a special election while he was under indictment. He was convicted in 1978 in a whole ghost workers scheme that was involved then patronage boss Peter Camille and former Senator Cian Franny from Philadelphia. But that conviction was overturned in 1981. And because of that, I always thought any future investigation, he's already been indicted by the feds once, you would think somebody who's a member of Mensa would be pretty careful about how they conduct their business. He wasn't, and paid the price.
And again, John, you said that when you looked at all of his various homes and how many floors they had, it was a total of 19 floors.
Right. So he needed 19 orcs.
Exactly. That's how the world works. Right. I know. At my humble Cape Cod house, there's 2 stories, and I have 1. The reason I'm so fascinated by this is that when this came out, I too had an Oreck vacuum. And the Oreck vacuums were known for being lightweight, so you could carry them around easily. So to me, it was just the opposite of needing 1 vacuum for every floor, because they were, pretty easy to take around. Brad, I'm sure you covered this trial in detail as well in one of your books.
I did, and spent a lot of time, looking at Senator Fumo's history. And the thing that strikes me is the power that he amassed in the Senate. As a minority member of the Democratic Party, Republicans controlled the Senate 98% of the time that he was there. And he went about this in a way that no one realized till later, but he had people placed through state agencies that were loyal to him. He had, all these allies, people that he got jobs. He just could get a lot of things done for good or bad. And secondly, he was feared. People were very scared of Senator Fumo. They're not, sure what he could do. All of that said, on the flip side of Senator Fumo, if I was a needy person in Philadelphia, South Philadelphia, and I could have 1 person to represent me as a senator, it would be Senator Fumo, because he could get things done. He could get the $8 billion above normal appropriations. He could get things for the district. I think there was a real benefit to that was lost out of this. Corrupt, yes, according to the prosecutors who pursued him for 4 years in this investigation. And yes, he was Mensa, but the way they where eventually they were able to crack the security code of his computer system and flipped a couple of the IT people who had worked for him. And once they did that, they were able to get in and see some of this stuff. But he was, as John says, larger than life. And I think I haven't seen anybody in the governor's office or in the legislature who had the kind of presence and stature that Fumo did.
So I'm going to take exception to the entire, regardless of his political affiliation, the whole kind of, well, he did good things while he was in office too. No shit. That's what you're supposed to do in public office. You're supposed to serve the people. So having some sort of, let's regale him because he did some good things during all of his criminality, that to me is just a load of, what. And again, let's remember, he was not giving out his own money. He was redistributing taxpayer dollars to Philadelphia. And you know what? Maybe some of that $8 billion was needed and necessary, but there's lots of other places in the state that probably needed the money just as much or even more than Philadelphia. So I always remind people when we're talking about trying to laud some legislator about moving other people's money around, taxpayer money around. I'm like, look, you don't just invent more tax dollars. If some place gets more, that means some other place got less. On the flip side, I too was just in marvel of him doing this literally, as you said, 98% of the time as a member of the Senate minority. And for many of those years, the Senate Democrats were an afterthought. It wasn't like they were close to almost getting the majority. They were just an afterthought. But because he was so crafty and so intelligent and had his, octopus, tentacles out there, he was able to, I forget, one of you said in our pre-production meeting, he could get people hired and fired with one phone call.
Senator Fumo made the case for the people that I covered in the western part of the state who constantly complained that, Philadelphia gets all the money. We don't get anything out here. And, when you look at what, we finally do find out that he got this extra $8 billion, it was true that a lot of this money was going there. And yeah, to a lot of people, that's not fair. I get that. I preface that by saying, if I lived in the district and really needed help, needed assistance, maybe that's his job anyway, but he certainly, got the money. But made the case, Philadelphia's locking down the money and we're not getting it, which was a constant refrain from his critics.
Yeah, and the thing about Vince that gets overlooked is that while he held these reins of power in Harrisburg, that he was famous for getting things done, not always just the things that he wanted. I mean, he would rack up IOUs from both parties, from every branch of government, because if something was deadlocked, that's the person that you wanted involved in the negotiations. I mean, his staff had T-shirts that were emblazoned with the initials WGSD, which stood for We Get Shit Done. And they did. And I covered him for a long, long time, and I don't believe he ever lied to me. What he would do is, if he was involved in something that I was writing about and I needed his view or his opinion or his info, I'd go sit in the back of the of the state Senate, where there was a line of seats for press, catch his eye, and come wave to him to come back and talk to me. And if he was involved in a bad way, he would just shake his head no and smile. So he wasn't going to lie to me, but he wasn't going to talk to me either. But again, his power was just unparalleled, unmatched. There was nobody in my 32 years covering Philadelphia in Harrisburg who had that power. And from what I've observed, nobody since.
Governors, no matter whether they were Republican or Democrat, had to go through him eventually. And he knew that because he controlled, the purse strings to a large degree over there, even as a Senate Democrat, and could make deals with other people. And you couldn't win that battle with Vince when it came to the carving up the pie. That was his forte.
So the question then becomes, why, if you're in such a position where you have such control over not only your destiny, but many others, why would you go so far afield as to risk everything? And the answer, I think, came out in emails that he sent from prison, none of which are private. Any prisoner in a state or federal facility who uses an email function, that everybody every official in that prison has access to it. He was emailing with his psychiatrist. What could be more private? Well, it wasn't. And his psychiatrist opined that Vince had an obsessive personality. He was obsessive about power and about acquisition, whether it's women, boats, cars, planes, objects, vacuum cleaners, whatever it was. He had to have it. Couldn't help himself. In the end, it was Vince's own personality that led to his undoing.
Well, okay. I still think we're letting him off light. But, John, I believe it was you in one of our early meetings.
Well, no, wait, Chris. Let's remember, you're talking to two journalists. We're not moralists. We want good story. Right?
Okay, so,
I mean,
he was way up there for you folks, right?
Listen, he was a great story. I'm not going to judge somebody on the basis of what is their moral basis and how horrible they are and they should do this and they should do that. I just want to write about them.
Right. And the issue that got to what you're talking about is look at the amount of time that he was sentenced to compared to a lot of other Pauls in Philadelphia who got, much stiffer sentences. So, he's getting off there. Well, that's the court system, and that's something that we write about, and we did write about when you compare the sentences. But I understand your point, but I agree with John. We're not moralists or prosecutors or defense attorneys.
Okay, guys. Well, one of you is retired and one of you is semi-retired. So, you can moralize a little bit. And I'm not a journalist, although obviously I like to hang around with them. But, John, I think it was you told us a story in our pre-production meeting for this about how far Fumo went to screw over then state representative Josh Shapiro.
This Pennsylvania Political Digest podcast is supported by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, where business in Pennsylvania is our business and has been since our founding in 1909. For more information, please visit pamanufacturers.org.
Yeah, this is in a book called The Senator by a former Philadelphia Inquirer reporter who makes note of the fact that Vince would act sometimes against his own interest if somebody pissed him off. And apparently, one instance that's reported in this book is that then State Rep Josh Shapiro was working on something with Vince, some legislation that they both wanted. And in some way, Shapiro pissed Vince off. So Vince, out of nowhere, killed the legislation, even though it was something that he wanted. And Shapiro is quoted in the book as saying he was impressed at the extent to which Vince would go to make his point.
And Vince knew that he could come back and get it some other way.
Probably, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was the part about what a psychiatrist called him being obsessive.
Obsessive, yeah.
And
with power,
compulsive.
obsessive with his power.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, it is almost movie-like, some of his behavior, because I traveled with him on election days on occasion in Philadelphia, which is always a hoot. And on one occasion, we were in a very large vehicle with some very large other individuals, Vince in the front, me in the back. And we stop at a polling place in South Philly on a very narrow street, and pulling up, this large SUV that we're in clips the mirror of an older model vehicle that's parked in front of a row house. And a woman in curlers and a robe comes screaming out of the house, "You broke my car, you broke my car." Vince pays no attention. A large individual with Vince opens his pocket and starts peeling out 20s and doesn't stop until the woman stops yelling. So
I just find it funny that you had to go tell us that it was a narrow street in South Philly. Every street in South Philly.
This is for our Greene County listeners.
Every street. So I'm just flashing back. I remember, again, I want to milk this Oreck vacuum thing for all it's worth. I remember when I bought the Oreck vacuum, the amount of money I had to lay out for one. So I'm just thinking, here comes Vinny Fumo or one of his people, And you go, or Oric vacuum cleaners, I don't know if they still do, they had stores. So imagine the salesperson who, did that transaction. You want how many vacuums, sir? 19? The guy probably sold his whole yearly allotment in that one transaction.
Or he could have done it in segments. He goes in and gets 6 and goes, nah, I need 7 more. I got to go back and get some more, and made 2 or 3 trips in for Oric vacuum.
And then, I can't imagine, I didn't know him like you guys. I don't think I ever met him in a private setting. But he doesn't strike me as the type of guy who was vacuuming his own damn house or mansion.
Not a chance.
So it wasn't like he was getting tired of lugging a vacuum from the first floor to the second floor. He obviously had staff doing that, either housekeepers or actual political staff. So I don't know, did they complain? Did he say, oh, I'll help you out, I'll get another vacuum?
Chris, he was thinking of others.
So as we wrap up on this, John, any final comments on the man you deemed the Vince of darkness and what he thought about that moniker you came up with for him?
Yeah, look, he's still around. He's still involved in some level. Like I say, he's trying to sell his what was called the castle in the city. As a journalist, he was, and I think Brad can agree with this. I mean, we had the best of times. I mean, both of us, our careers matched Pennsylvania's worst, which for a journalist, it couldn't be any better. And Vince was a big part of that at every step of the way. And I've had, and I'm sure Brad would attest to this as well, I've had so much fun covering the horror that Pennsylvania politics and corruption has been. And so just appreciate the fact that I got to live through it and write about it.
Yeah, I would concur. And it was exciting. It was always a case, how much worse is it going to get? Is this the end of it? Oh, there's going to be another case down the road. And surely there was, and they just kept coming. The hits kept coming.
And now we turn our focus to our secondary story in episode 3 of the Pennsylvania Political Digest podcast, a stroll through the annals of Pennsylvania political corruption, aptly known by just one name, ABSCAM. This was back in the late 70s, early 80s, when the FBI decided that they would go around and try to solicit, bribes giving money to members of Congress. And they would do so dressed up as Arab sheiks. And one of the reasons that I'd love to know where that great idea came from. So they're dressing up as Arab sheiks. And again, this is late 70s, early 80s. There's no YouTube. There's no internet. So I can only imagine the accents the FBI agents used as when they were posing as these fake Arab sheiks. But one of the reasons I've thought, and Brad, I knew you agree with this, one of the reasons I think it so permeated culture was that it was not something that was just written about. They videotaped themselves offering money and bribes to these members of Congress. So when it came time to adjudicate it, they had videotapes they could use.
Chris, it was unprecedented at this level that you would have videotape of members of Congress being offered cash and in some cases walking off with a suitcase full of cash, as happened with one of our Pennsylvania reps, Ozzie Myers, $50,000 in a suitcase. And he walks off, and his classic line of all time was, "Money talks, bullshit walks." And he'll eventually come full circle for us and is back, as John and I talked about before. Is there yet another investigation? Myers, after he serves 3 years in prison, winds up being charged with election fraud in 2020 for bribing judges to get votes, for the candidates he favored in Philadelphia. So ABSCAM became an important part of our culture. It was a bold and significant legal venture because there'd never been anything like it. And look, there was a lot of criticism of it. And some of it was from the judges who sat on the bench that said, you can't just go up and offer somebody cash if you don't have a predicate. You don't have a reason to believe that they committed a crime. Well, what they were trying to do with this whole investigation was, this was centered in Philly and South Jersey and part of northern Jersey. and it was about the casinos that had just been legalized in Atlantic City. And there was all sorts of concern about organized crime infiltrating the casinos. But there were other aspects to it, too. It was about immigration, if people needed it, if they just wanted to have somebody who could do political favors for them. Another representative of Pennsylvania, Representative Raymond Lederer, was more of a general guy, and he agreed to take money, and he said, "You will get all of me in return." I mean, that was really, he was on the payroll for the sheiks, he thought. But it was controversial. But you know what? In the end, every ABSCAM case that was appealed was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court.
John, did it ever come out in court what supposed country these Arab sheiks were from? Did anybody ever figure that out?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I guess this was a time when all of the Arab nations, because of oil production, were beginning to rise in prominence and money. And so the stereotypical, well, if he's Arab, he must be wealthy. Well, let's at least talk to him.
This reminds me of a lot of the old Marx Brothers movies where you'd have some made-up country name that they were involved with, the crown prince of something. So I know ABSCAM was maybe a little bit before your time, but your thoughts, John?
Well, I mean, I love the movie.
American Hustle.
American Hustle.
With Bradley Cooper.
With
Philadelphia is probably number one non-governmental booster.
Yeah, and star. And because of what you just talked about, the fact that it was on tape and people could actually see stuff, it was the beginning of a new era in law enforcement. And the technology that has grown from that has made it a little bit tougher for everybody who wants to break the law to get away with it. Because now, I mean, even on a street corner, there are cameras in cities. Everybody carries a camera in their pocket. It's tough on criminals, and it started back then.
There were 31 officials targeted in ABSCAM, which, by the way, was the FBI code name for this investigation. And as criticism of it mounted, they changed it to ABSCAM from ArabScam. I'm not sure how that got them more politically correct, but that's what it was.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to send feedback or make a contribution, head over to papoliticaldigest.com. That's papoliticaldigest.com. Thank you.
31 people targeted. There were 6 U.S. House members and 1 U.S. Senator, Harrison Williams in New Jersey, convicted in all of this. There were 3 Philadelphia city councilmen who were convicted, and assorted Jersey types, who also took cash and were filmed. And it was an amazing thing. And the movie American Hustle was like the latest version of the Donnie Brasco, a mob flick that had come out, I guess, in the 80s. Also, it made reference to ABSCAM, and they had a boat as part of it. And there actually was a yacht that was used to entertain some of these people, like the Arab sheiks would have these yachts. Back to Ozzie Myers, he didn't learn from all of this and winds up back in court, and is an example of recidivism in Pennsylvania politics.
Well, Ozzie Myers went back to what he knew best, which was Philadelphia election corruption. And this case involved him going to folks who manned the polls on election day and bribing them to add votes to the totals. This was back when Philadelphia and a lot of suburban Philadelphia counties voted on these big, black, hulking machines that you'd use levers on to vote with. And so he obviously didn't think of this, and, maybe he just wasn't that smart to begin with, but you'd have situations where the machine would say that 250 people total voted in that division in Philadelphia. Philadelphia calls their precincts divisions. But one candidate running for judge, his favorite candidate, got 280 votes. Well, how do you get 280 votes on a machine where only 250 people walked in? And he obviously didn't care about that, nor did the Philadelphia judge types who basically paid him to pad their vote totals. It's just no getting around. It was just the most blatant case of political corruption. So I give the guy credit for being consistent.
Yeah, he was consistent, but in ABSCAM, he was paid the bribes, and here he was paying people off later. So he actually got a little smarter, Chris.
He was trying to move up the food chain. John, anything final on ABSCAM before we move a little bit forward in Philadelphia members of Congress going haywire?
Well, only the fact that, as Brad said, there were 31 people that were approached. Not everybody took it. I mean, there were people that denied it, and I don't know why they didn't raise up that in campaigns. Maybe they did, and for re-election, saying, I'm proven to be honest, right? I mean,
battle tested by the FBI.
Right.
It is, unless the person said maybe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Give me a while to think about it, right?
Yeah.
But one was a powerful Pennsylvania congressman who was approached and did not take it, right?
Right. That was
Jack Murtha, right?
Right.
correct. Jack Murtha, and he was on tape, and he did not agree to take the money.
So I think that's good that we mentioned someone who actually did what they were supposed to. So we're going to move forward a couple decades to yet another troublesome member of Congress from Philadelphia by the name of Chaka Fattah, who came into office as a reformer, and as I said in the intro, ended up going to jail for all the usual Philadelphia reasons, and one of the only in Pennsylvania type of things, only in Philadelphia type of things, that his wife was the top anchor at the NBC affiliate in Philadelphia. So you have this ongoing trial happening, and what do you do if you're the top news anchor on the station? You can't be talking about that story that involves your husband. So John, Chaka Fattah, Philadelphia, and your thoughts on his rise and fall and ultimately going off to jail for all the usual Philadelphia reasons?
Yeah, it's another one of those stories where somebody who was pegged as having a lot of potential and a great future in politics just went awry. Arthur Davenport is his real name. He was raised in West Philadelphia. His father was an Army sergeant. His mother was an editor at the Philadelphia Tribune, the city's famous, very old black newspaper. But his parents divorced when he was young, and his mother remarried a community activist by the name of David Fattah. She changed Arthur's name to Chaka, an honorary of a Zulu king, and she took the name Falaka Fattah. She became famous. She founded something called the House of Umoja, which was been described as an urban boys' town, and drew national attention for trying to do good in an area of the city where not a lot of good was happening. Became known as Queen Mother Falaka Fattah. Really did get a lot of the national attention when Chaka was a boy and in his younger years. He went to Penn, great Ivy League school, Fels Institute of Government at Penn also. He was elected to the State House in 82, to the State Senate in 88, and to Congress in 94. He ran for mayor in 2007, and there was a great flap about whether his then wife should be involved in any coverage of the mayor's race. It's my recollection that she stayed on the station, but not on that story. He finished fourth in a crowded field, ultimately won by a Democratic primary, of course, is the pretty much preemptive, you're going to be the mayor if you win the Democratic primary in Philly. Michael Nutter, that was Michael Nutter's first election. And the reason he finished fourth was true to his West Philadelphia constituency. He would not get on board Mumia Abu Jamal, a very famous Philadelphia cop murder case, has been seeking a new trial for decades. And Fattah did not speak out against that. And crime then as now is a great issue, big issue in Philadelphia. So that cost him in that race. He finished well down. But early in his career, he was named by Time magazine as one of the 50 most promising political leaders in the country. But after a long federal investigation, in 2015, he was indicted as a congressman for racketeering, bank fraud, bribery, all of it stemming from an off-the-books $1 million loan to his mayoral campaign and other things. But he was a rising star no more. He was a 20-year incumbent at that time and a senior member of House Appropriations. He was convicted in 2016 basically for orchestrating the theft of $600,000 in charitable funds and federal grants to pay off this illegal campaign loan, and using campaign funds for tuition and student loan payments for his son, Chaka Jr., and disguising those payments as being made to a consulting firm. Your reference to the $18,000 Porsche, that involved then Deputy Mayor Herb Vetterman, who was convicted because he had been bribing Fattah in an effort to get an ambassadorship or other federal appointment. Remember, President Obama was in office at the time. So we had this $18,000 that Fattah and his wife, Renee, said they want to borrow to buy a Pocono retreat house. And Fattah's lawyers claimed that it was payment for a Porsche, which, as you mentioned, Chris, never left Fattah's garage. So he was sentenced to 10 years. He appealed. He won a partial appeal. He got a bribery conviction overturned, but he was resentenced for another 10 years. And then late in 2020, the COVID year, he was released into something they called community confinement. We would call it house arrest. And the feds never said why. There was a lot of speculation that they wanted to clear out the prisons because of the COVID risks and that they chose people who were not violent criminals. And now, former congressman is a consultant to something called the Fattah Neuroscience Global Advisors, which is described as advancing brain science and health-related research globally. So I guess he kind of landed on his feet, but not in the U.S. House.
Some people had speculated that he got released from federal prison during the height of COVID before there were, jabs or inoculations, as people call them, is that the Bureau of Prisons didn't want to have the spectacle of a former member of Congress dying under their supposed care in prison. But as you said, nobody ever actually came out and said why, which I always felt was kind of odd.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense that was the reason. I don't know for a fact that it was, but they would not want something like that happening on their watch. That would been terrible. It was terrible. Anybody died, but they wouldn't certainly want a member of Congress. I think Chaka Fattah was a decent guy. Now that's, don't get your Republican consultant thing up. But when I had very little contact with him, but the minimal contact I had in the 80s when he was a state house member and a senator, he was a nice guy. The question becomes, he had all this going for him, including 20 years in Congress. Why would he reach to the extent that he did in this final effort? That's the thing that blows my mind about some of these people. Why did they go that far?
Why indeed? And if you're Herb Vetterman and you're trying to get an ambassadorship, why are you bothering to bribe a member of the House? All that stuff goes through the Senate, okay? So I always chuckled about that here was Fattah supposedly taking bribes from the guy and not really ever being in a position to help him out with his desire to be, an ambassador to somewhere. But let's think about this. What caused his downfall, as John said, was he took an illegal campaign contribution when he was running for mayor. You have campaign contribution limits, and he got around that by having somebody lending him money so he could then use that money, quote unquote, his own money, to help his mayoral race. And there's a guy who had been in the state house, the state senate, was a senior member in Congress, was in one of the safest Democratic congressional districts, not in the state, in the country, had everything going for him. And he mortgaged all that to try and become mayor.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a familiar story that people who have power for a long time lose their sense of what else do I need? What else do I want? Why do you need or want anything else? I mean, you're in a great position in life. And Brad is right. I mean, look, he was on a personal level. He seemed like a very decent human being. He was clearly smart. He was engaging. I covered him while he was in Congress and while he was in the state legislature. Got to know him a little bit. He was always thoughtful. I was one of the ones that, when he was in the House back in the late 80s, I pegged him as somebody to keep an eye on. And apparently the feds took me at my word.
Yeah, they kept an eye on him already.
Yeah. And all of these people assuage themselves with the old trope that that they were convicted. These are political convictions. They were sought out because they're Democrats, because they're black, because they have opponents in their own party. It wasn't really their fault. Everybody does these kinds of things.
Yada, 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 really.
And on and on and on. I mean, how many Donald Trump? You don't need to look back to find people that say, the only reason I'm being prosecuted is for political gain from somebody else.
The other thing that you hear from a number of these officials, no matter their rank, if they're convicted, is people don't know how much time, how much of my own money and effort I put into this. Anything that I was arguably getting back, it doesn't come close to the amount of time that I put in working for the people, right? That's what they say.
Well, let's remember it's supposed to be public service. You're paid to help people. I know that may be a new thought to some of these folks, especially in Philadelphia. As we wrap up episode 3, I just want to remind folks that even though Philadelphia is the largest municipality in the state, as both a city and a county, I still believe, as we've talked about here and we'll talk about later, that it quote unquote punches above its weight class in terms of corruption. That it just goes on and on and on, and an entire court system, multiple generations of members of the legislature and of Congress, multiple members of the city council. And the thing that irks so many people, myself included, as we conclude today, is that too many people view it as entertainment and sport, and that's just Philly. And all that ultimately hurts is the people of Philadelphia. Welcome back, and thank you for listening and for posing some questions to us via our email, papoliticaldigest@gmail.com. And guys, one of the questions we've received from folks is they've heard me and you talk about your books that you've written, Brad on political corruption and John on Pennsylvania politics more in general. So to answer the listeners' questions, let's give you guys a moment to promo your books. John?
Well, thanks, Chris. My book is really less of a chronological history of Pennsylvania. It doesn't go into a lot of things that happened, but it's sort of a merry journey through just the foibles and the oddities of Pennsylvania politics over 25 years. It's called On the Front Lines of Pennsylvania Politics, 25 years of Keystone Reporting. And to sum it up, I think the best way, a friend of mine noticed after the book came out, I didn't see it, the publisher didn't see it, but she said, "Do you know the 2 most repeated phrases in your book?" I said, "I don't." She said, "Well, one is, I am not making this up, and the other is, he also went to prison." So
those are the repeating lines, John, in your book?
Yes, those are recurring phrases that I didn't even notice I was using, but I guess in both instances, they had to be used.
Now, one of the reasons I like your book is there's a picture of at least part of my face in it. And I like yours, Brad, because I'm not in it. And Brad, you wrote not 1, but 2 books.
Just because there was so much corruption to keep track of. The first book was called Keystone Corruption. It was written in 2013. It's by Camino Books. And it starts with the Capitol graft scandal at the turn of the 20th century.
That we talked about in
the
first episode.
Yeah, and just the what took place during that scandal, and then goes up through different segments. It's not complete historically, but I just pick the highlights or low points, however you want to look at it, of a chapter on Bud Dwyer, 2 chapters on Bud Dwyer, 2 on Vince Fumo, the former state senator, and Al Benedict gets his own chapter called The Bum Steer.
And then what was the second book called?
It was called Keystone Corruption Continued, Cash Payoffs, Porngate, and the Kathleen Kane Scandal.
Your book was just overflowing with so much corruption that you needed to...
I couldn't fit it all in the name.
You couldn't fit it all in the name. And your first book was 2013, and the next one came out...
2019.
2000. This just took you a couple of years to catch up with all the corruption. There was so much going on, and you're still like regular guys, so obviously you didn't become multimillionaires off of your book. But I know from talking to other people who've written books, especially about what they've done with their life, in your case, journalism and politics, that was very, very fulfilling to get the additional space to tell your stories more in the way that you wanted without the deadlines of daily journalism. You guys wrote a lot in the pre-internet age when your stories had to actually be only a certain length because there was only a certain amount in the Dead Tree edition of the paper to be allotted to it. And in books, you guys could run wild.
And we didn't have to put -30 at the end of it like you did on a typewriter. But.
So I thank you, fellas, for helping us answer that question. And I assume if folks go to their favorite online booksellers, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, to their independent bookstores online, they can order these up, and there are still copies available for purchase. Thank you.
Thank you.
So again, thanks for being with us on episode 3. We'll be back shortly with episode 4. Thank you for listening. I want to thank our esteemed journalists, John Baer and Brad Bumstead. I want to thank our sound engineer, Tucker Nicholas. Thank you. The bumper music you've heard is courtesy of Interstate 81. I'm your host, Republican political consultant Christopher Nicholas. If you have any comments about our podcast, any tips, any replies, please send your emails to papoliticaldigest@gmail.com. That's papoliticaldigest@gmail.com. If they're interesting, we might read them on the air. Copyright 2023 Equal Consulting Group, Inc.,